Okay, hello there, Stefania and Jackie and everybody else. Remember, if you're an APUSH, go to fiveable.me. Yes, Katerina, you made me proud too. I'm letting my Instagram following know that we're here. So come on over here and review with us. Okay, so thank y'all so much for joining us, and I'm going over to Fiveable. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're here and we're going to be focusing on the progressive era. Okay. We're going to be focusing on the progressive era. That is our focus area tonight. But of course, you are free to answer, to ask any questions you would like. Tell me in the chat, what are y'all studying right now? Let me kind of get a feel for what people are studying and all of that good stuff. So, y'all get that going. Let's get some questions in here. So, if you've got questions, now I've got a few things that I'm going to talk to y'all about, but let's go ahead and get those questions in here so that we can go ahead and make sure to answer things. Okay, good deal. So y'all are actually talking about this right now. So this is well timed for Lily's class. Very good. Well, go ahead and go to ask a question. Okay, so if you've got a particular question for me, I would love to go ahead and answer that. And for a second, I'm going to work on a couple of things that I've got going right now. And y'all just, y'all get those questions in, and we will start the presentation very, very shortly. All right, so let's see. We need to still working on a few tables here. All right, so let's go with that. All right, and I'm going to make a little something about the progressive presidents. And so, yeah, we're going to focus on the progressive era, but then again, if other people are doing some other things, we're totally good with that too. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start some things, but let me know what y'all want to focus on, because the thing about Fiveable is it's customizable. Like, we've got some things that we're doing, but we've also got some things that you can tell us you need done. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow. All right, so let me get those guys on here. And there we go. And we'll get that table set up. Again, get your questions in. Get your questions in, so that we can make sure that everything is, that we're getting everything that we need there. All right, so Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. All right, and to make that a little neater, I think I might just put William Howard Taft's middle initial. How about that? All right. Whoa, oops. No. Y'all don't even see what I'm doing over here, but I'm trying to get this thing set up here. All right. So we are going to distribute those rows again. Oh, I see what's going on there. All right. I'm going to come back very shortly, and I am expecting to see some questions. Okay. So let's get those questions in. All right, and this thing, I'm just having a little bit of a hard time formatting, but it's going to look great by the time y'all see it. Okay, I'm kind of proud of how it's looking. All right, so all right, coming in, warning time, going once, going twice, and all right, I think we are ready to get started. I'm looking forward to seeing some great questions. All right. Okay, I've got 4 questions. All right, excellent. Now, remember, whatever y'all are asking about, go ahead and put it in there. All right, so we've got some questions. Now, remember also what we want to do is if you like a particular question, okay, make sure to upvote it, okay, because again, I'm going to be talking about focusing on the progressive era, but if it's evident that there are a lot of people here who are wanting to talk about something else, I see somebody still doing imperialism, so that's that's there as well. Now, ladies and gentlemen, make sure that when you ask questions, okay, they need to be questions that are specific. Okay, so as far as that, Cecilia, we're not getting specific enough there. The way that these sessions work and the way that they're archived is they're sorted by topic. So when I answer questions, it says here, okay, this is what what's going on there, and somebody can go back to a specific part. Okay, so as far as that goes, now Lily, here's a question. Let me start with your question here. Okay, so when I pick Lily's question, Lily's asking, can I explain the difference between Roosevelt's views on African Americans versus Taft? Okay, and what I want to do here, and that's part of my job, is to steer y'all in the correct direction. Okay, because I don't really know the answer to that question, which means that it's probably not going to be anywhere that you need on the exam. But one thing that would be useful here, okay, because what we do see that's very relevant, we could compare Teddy Roosevelt to Woodrow Wilson. Okay, so that would be something that would be worthwhile. Okay, because although Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were both progressive era presidents, Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican and Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. Now, Woodrow Wilson was also raised in the South, although let's not forget that Teddy Roosevelt's mother was from the South as well. And finally, let's not forget that racism was something that was a national phenomenon, not necessarily unique to the South. So with all of those things in mind, we want to start answering this question, okay? So Roosevelt's views, and what I'm going to do is we're going to edit this question, okay? I'm going to edit this just a little bit on African Americans versus Wilson. Okay, so really you're going to see more differentiation there. All right, so what we need to know here, okay, so I'm going to share the screen here, and I'm going to come up with a nice little graphic template. Okay, and so as far as that, we're going to be working on that in a little bit there, but let me go ahead and get rid of, I need to make a blank template at some point. But as far as that goes, let's go ahead and compare Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Okay, so as far as that, Roosevelt versus Wilson, TR versus Woodrow Wilson on race. Okay, so we're looking at Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. All right, so for one thing, okay, what we need first is a little bit of context. Oh, it looks like I got rid of all of my little boxes there. Okay, so let's go ahead and get that box and bring it back over here. Okay, so as far as context, okay, so a bit of context that might be useful. Black voters voted Republican at that time, so he was a Republican, and that is something worth noting, that Black voters supported the GOP at that time. Okay, and so as far as that goes, we want to understand that. Now on the next part here, we want to understand where Woodrow Wilson's coming from, that Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. Okay, and of course today, Black voters, and that's when we think about change over time and that sort of thing, so Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. And of course, the Democratic Party, was very heavily supported to white Southerners. Okay, so owed his election to white Southerners, white Southerners who supported Jim Crow. Okay, now as far as that goes, now we're not gonna act like Teddy Roosevelt was some sort of great, grand pioneer of racial equality or something like that. But what we can note is there was a specific episode. Okay, so as far as that goes, we could see where let's see. So I just need to let's see, white Southerners who supported Jim Crow. And I'm trying to make this thing go real nice. Let's see what it looks like at 22. All right. So as far as that goes, we need to look into pieces of evidence. Okay, so we've got a little context there. And Teddy Roosevelt, there was a very famous episode where he had dinner with Booker T. Washington. Okay, so as far as that goes, he had dinner at the White House. Had dinner at the White House with Booker T. Washington. So that would be something that so dinner at the White House with Booker T. Washington. Now, that's something that, when you're having dinner with somebody, okay, so he's inviting Booker T. Washington to the White House, and he had dinner with Booker T. Washington, but this angered a lot of people, okay, because when you invite somebody over for dinner, you break bread with them, you are acknowledging their equality. Now, even though Booker T. Washington really, did not have an agenda that threatened Jim Crow in any serious way, it was still the idea of a black man in the White House, was too much, for a lot of white Southern leaders. Okay, so hostile reactions to reactions from Southern white leaders. Okay. Now, so as far as that, now there's one other piece of evidence that we could put here. Let me just note here. I'm going to need to Google this just to make sure that I've got this. I want to make sure I'm not leading you astray. But there's an appointee. I forget if it was the Charleston Customs House, but so let's see. Teddy Roosevelt. Let's see, black appointee to customs. Okay, so let me see here. Okay, so as far as that goes, yes, the correct. Okay, so William Demosthenes Crum. Okay, so we've got actually. That's so the Booker T. Washington dinner there. So this, okay, so he. We'll go ahead and note this. Okay, that site does not like us. Okay, that's fine. Maybe this site will. Okay, so there is another one that now you may not remember this person's name necessarily. It's like kind of a one-off sort of thing. It's not like Teddy Roosevelt that you put a lot of stuff in there. But as far as that goes, let's see. All right, the South Carolina Encyclopedia doesn't get straight to the point, but so basically in 1902, okay, so an attempt to unify the Republican Party in South Carolina, okay, so nominated Crum as the so widespread Southern opposition catapulted Crum into national prominence. Even the New York Times and New York Herald criticized the nomination as ill-advised. In South Carolina, U.S. Senator Ben Tillman and editor James C. Hemphill of the Charleston News and Courier jointly denounced Crum. Tillman temporarily derailed the nomination, but Roosevelt kept Crum in the position through interim appointments until his January 1905 confirmation. Okay, so what we see here is that Teddy Roosevelt was willing to take this stand. Okay, so as far as that goes, he made William Crum the tax code, basically the customs house collector in Charleston. Now, remember, that is right there in South Carolina. So a lot of hostile reactions there. So hostile reaction from Southern white leaders. Never did it again. Okay, did it again, but he did. Now, what was the date? Now, this is a little bit of an inquiry here, but what was the date of the dinner? Now, we're talking about 1902 here. So Roosevelt dinner with Booker T. Washington. Okay, so as far as that goes, we see here that was in 1901. Okay, so even though President Roosevelt never did that again, okay, but he did appoint William Crum, okay, William Crum as customs collector for Charleston. Okay, so Charleston over many objections. Okay. And you notice, like in that entry we were looking at, that there was also like Northern criticism here. Okay. So be careful, like to think, also I love reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. Is one of my favorite books. And that one, goes into, you see where, it said that the New York Times and, other papers were saying this wasn't really smart. You're appointing this guy, but Teddy Roosevelt stuck to his guns. Okay. So he did appoint this person. So by the standards of his time, Teddy Roosevelt stuck his neck out a few times for Black Americans at that time. Okay. Now, meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal workforce. Okay. So segregated the federal workforce, which had been integrated under previous Republican presidents. Okay. So Woodrow Wilson, a fan, a fan of the movie, of the controversial movie Birth of a Nation. Okay, so that's something as well. You should be familiar with this title. Okay, Birth of a Nation was a movie that came out during the Progressive era in 1915, and it became, it's the highest grossing silent film of all time. But it was also screened in the White House, and it portrayed the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, it portrayed the first Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction as something that was heroic. Okay, as something that's heroic, and that's seen as a causal factor. Leading to the second Ku Klux Klan, which was organized really more than anything. Now, for one thing, there was the Great Migration of African Americans, and then on top of that, there was also the wave of new immigrants. Okay, so the second Ku Klux Klan was really strongest in the Midwest, and it was as much anti-immigrant as and anti-Catholic as it was anti-Black. But Wilson, a fan of the controversial movie Birth of a Nation, he was quoted in it. Okay, so he was quoted in the movie. Like, his book was actually quoted, his book, which had shown the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction in a heroic light. So he segregated the federal workforce, which had previously been integrated. Okay, so as far as that goes, okay, so when you look at something like this, the context, I think, is very important here. Noting that, you're looking at one party who, had the support of Black voters, and another party who, had the support from the solid South. Okay, so basically, as far as that to, owed election partly to the Jim Crow era solid South. Okay, like, this is a phenomenon that you should be familiar with. For example, if we look at so let's see, U.S. presidential election of 1912. Okay, so if we go in the U.S. presidential election of 1912, we can see here that Wilson is unanimously, now he's got a lot of support here because the Republican Party was divided that year. But then when we look back at the previous presidents, so we look at 1908 when William Howard Taft was elected. And we see here that, the Republicans are pretty dominant in the rest of the country. And, besides a few states, besides Nevada, Colorado, and Nebraska, every state that voted Democratic was a former slave state. And then we go back to 1904, when Teddy Roosevelt was elected to the president in his own right. And what you see here is basically the former Confederate States of America plus Kentucky and Maryland. And all of the rest of the country is voting Republican. And even the populists before that, okay, so when we go back to the election of 1896, The Populist Party, even though it had a lot of support among Southern farmers, it was not able to break into the South and get electoral votes. Now, of course, William Jennings Bryan, you see the fusion of populists with the Democratic Party there in 1892 when the Populists had their own candidate. Even though they had a lot of support in the South, they were unable to break that solid South voting bloc, which is pretty much constant for the most part between the end of Reconstruction and the post, World War II. 1948 is when you start to see a little bit there. Now, also there was the other one in 1928 when the country was experiencing the so-called Coolidge prosperity. And, then on top of it being prosperous, remember, voters, when the economy's good, they tend to say, oh, that's the president's fault. When the economy's bad, it's the president's fault, you see? And so as far as that, the economy was good, and the Democrats nominated a Catholic, which didn't sit well with Southern voters in the 1920s. And so a few Southern states actually went Republican that year. But other than that, the solid South is a political phenomenon that has to be understood in the context of, what party is in power. And for that whole time, the Democratic Party counted on the support of the leadership of the Jim Crow South. So with that, glad we could answer that, and glad I could redirect you a little bit into something that I think is going to be would be something that would be useful for you on the test. Okay, so as far as that goes, I see here. Let's see. Can you explain? Sure. Okay. So as far as that goes, the Teller and Platt Amendment. Okay. Now here's the thing, Katie, you're spamming me. Okay. So what I'm going to, hey, well, I'm glad that I can help you. You're spamming me, Katie. And what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to actually, I think that this works well, that I'm just going to turn this question into the Teller Amendment and Platt Amendment. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and make this about those, because those two are related. The other stuff are not, it's not related to that. Okay. So just remember, as far as when you ask questions, now, if you want to ask Teller Amendment and Platt Amendment, because they both have to do with Cuba, then great, okay? But make sure that if you've got multiple questions, that you ask them as multiple questions, okay? Because we're starting to see attendance go up on these things, and I want to make sure it's organized. So the Teller Amendment and the Platt Amendment both had to do with Cuba. Now, first of all, the Teller Amendment, which said that it was before the United States gets involved in the Spanish-American War, I think right before or right during or something like that, and it said that the United States didn't have any intention to annex Cuba. And what I say about the Teller Amendment, the way I remember that is, go to Cuba and tell her we don't want her. Now, we don't want her in the literal sense. We don't want to annex her, but we still want to control her, okay? So Cuba, tell her we don't want her. We don't want her to be part of the United States, but we do want her to be under U.S. dominance. And that's where the Platt Amendment comes in. The Platt Amendment made some conditions on Cuba's constitution. So Cuba, you can be an independent country, but if there's civil unrest, the United States can send in troops to put down the civil unrest, because we need our neighbors to behave well. Remember that as far as that goes, American foreign policy at this time really treated Latin America like they were our children. Like when you look at Teddy Roosevelt's big stick policy and the Roosevelt corollary, it's about treating Latin American countries like their children. And so the Platt Amendment says that if there's civil unrest, the United States can come in. Cuba cannot make treaties without United States authorization. And then also the Cubans cannot have excessive public debt, and the United States, guess what? You got a nice little naval base there at Guantanamo Bay. We'll take that. So the Platt Amendment, even though the Teller Amendment said go to Cuba and tell her we don't want her, it's still, we are going to basically kind of have an apprenticeship. It's almost, it's sort of synonymous, if you think about it, with the black codes after, World War, sorry about that, after the Civil War, that, the South is, several Southern states, not necessarily all of them, and some of them the various degrees, but several Southern states passed these black codes that treated Black Americans, freedmen and women, as if they weren't, you're not quite a citizen, okay? That you're not a slave anymore, but you're not a citizen. And so as far as that goes, the United States is treating Cuba in the same way, that you can be independent from Spain and technically you're a country, you can have a flag and all of that, and you can manage your own internal affairs as long as you don't bother us. But if you do bother us, we're going to come in and we're going to discipline you. Okay, so it's really, you could make a comparison between the Platt Amendment and the Black Codes after the Civil War. So as far as that goes, thank you for that, Katie. And yeah, y'all remember, keep the questions related to one thing. Okay. Now the New Deal, that is, that's going to be something that, if I saw something about the New Deal, that we're going to discuss that more than likely later, unless we see just a huge thing here. So as far as that goes, let's see. All right. And we're also, Tyler, going to go into, we're going to have a segment on, on race relations at the turn of the century, Jim Crow, all of that kind of stuff, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois. That's going to happen. That's going to happen later. Okay. So as far as that goes, let's see, some important things we should know. Okay, so Cecilia, that's very, very general. Who were the most important leaders of the progressive era? Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to note the progressive presidents. Okay, so let's go ahead and just talk about some of the accomplishments of the progressive presidents. And I've got a chart ready to go that I just need to add. So as far as what we've got there, Teddy Roosevelt, okay? So Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. These are your three progressive era presidents, okay? So as far as that goes, Teddy Roosevelt, first of all, was known as a trust buster. Okay, so buster. Now, of course, the for the Northern Securities case. Now, it's not like he broke up all trust. Okay, so I'm going to note here at least the bad ones. Okay, so at least like the bad trust. Okay, so at least the bad ones. Okay, so the bad ones, as far as the ones that Teddy Roosevelt felt were very flagrant. Okay, so Northern Securities. Okay, so Northern Securities was a what the Northern Securities case was a case that earned Teddy Roosevelt the reputation as a trust buster, even though there were several other trusts that didn't necessarily they didn't get under his radar. Okay, so if they didn't get onto Teddy Roosevelt's radar, they were fine. Okay, now the other thing we have to remember is that Roosevelt was kind of limited in what he could do because of the legislation that he had available. Okay, so we want to note here, let's go ahead and just go into a big difference in the progressive era, between the progressive era and the Gilded Age. Okay, so as far as that goes, during the Gilded Age, government support for big business. Okay, so you've got the Great Railroad Strike, the Pullman Strike, the Pacific. Now, in both the Great Railroad Strike and the Pullman Strike, then the United States government weighed in fully on the side of big business and used military force in order to suppress these labor revolts. Now, also the Pacific Railroad Acts granted very generous subsidies for big business. So during the Gilded Age, the federal government was mostly occupied with doing what it could to support big business. Whereas during the progressive era, we start to see, a more of a focus focus on government regulation of big business. So we've got like the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act. There's also the coal strike. When we think about Teddy Roosevelt, who offered to mediate the coal strike. So the Meat Inspection Act, we'll note here the FDA, and then the coal strike. Okay, so the coal strike, TR mediated the coal strike instead of bringing the military in to fully support big business. Teddy Roosevelt said that I'm going to invite the business leaders and the labor leaders to the White House, and we're going to have a little conversation. And the business leaders, of course, they were like, don't forget who pays your campaign bills and that sort of thing. And Teddy Roosevelt was like, you know what? You don't want to show up? I'll just talk to whoever shows up. So if only the labor leaders show up, then I'll hear what they have to say. And the business leaders ended up showing up. Okay, so as far as that goes, Teddy Roosevelt was doing that. And then also the Meat Inspection Act, as I noted, and the FDA, which was created under Teddy Roosevelt's administration. And so then during the Gilded Age, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890, which was very weak antitrust legislation. Now, there was a popular outcry for antitrust legislation, and this legislation was used more against labor unions than it was against big business. Okay, and so as far as that goes, it wasn't very effective legislation. It was just, okay, we need an antitrust legislation, so let's put it out there. Okay. And so as far as that, then in 1914, now Woodrow Wilson was the first person, and that's not the Sherman Antitrust Act again, that's the Clayton Antitrust Act, okay, which was passed in 1914. And this was a strong piece of antitrust legislation that specifically exempted labor unions from its provisions. So we see here that, in the progressive era, the government is more likely to either mediate between big business and labor, as you see with TR, but also when you get into the Wilson era, you start to see the progressives in the government start to kind of tilt toward labor unions. And ever since then, we've had periods where, for example, during the 1920s, during a period of Republican dominance, you see that policy starts to shift, back toward business, away from labor. During the Depression, during the New Deal, FDR was, you had the Wagner Act, that created the National Labor Relations Board. And so that slanted the government toward labor unions. And then after World War II, you had the Taft-Hartley Act, which allowed states to become right-to-work states, basically to avoid union shop and closed shop and that sort of thing that required workers to join a union. And so, you see just in the 20th and 21st century, typically the Democratic Party is going to be more supportive of labor unions and the Republican Party less supportive. Now, of course, lately, a lot of rank and file union members are more prone to vote Republican. So we'll see what happens with that. And that's kind of been the case since Nixon for certain Republican candidates. And so as far as that goes, the Northern Securities case, okay, so he had a reputation as a trust buster because of that Northern Securities case. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and make that bold there. We'll make trust buster bold as well. And then, of course, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, okay? And then remember also that Teddy Roosevelt was also associated with, also associated with conservation efforts, okay? So he was a conservation man. All right, so Meat Inspection Act, Pure Food and Drug Act, and also, okay, sorry about this. This thing's just I need to get I'm using just the regular mouse. It's on my laptop. I probably need to get an external one. All right, so as far as that goes, and okay, come on now. All right, so there we go. Pure Food and Drug Act. And then finally, we'll note the conservation Okay, conservation efforts. Okay, so he was into conservation of nature as well, which before that the federal government really didn't have a horse in that race. Okay, now as far as that goes, William Howard Taft. Okay, now William Howard Taft actually, he prosecuted trust. Okay, so he went after trust more vigorously than TR. Actually went after, after Standard Oil. Okay, so including the Standard Oil Trust. Okay, now as far as that goes, that's probably now the Muckrakers. We want to talk about, can't really talk about the Progressive era without talking about the Muckrakers and Ida Tarbell. Okay, so Ida Tarbell, history of Standard Oil. Okay, so the history of the Standard Oil Company. She published this in 1904. Now, as far as that goes, she was, her muckraking piece on the Standard Oil Company really changed the way that a lot of people, thought about Standard Oil. Before that, John D. Rockefeller was seen largely as a hero, and Ida Tarbell's unflattering portrayal changed the way a lot of people in the public thought. And so, in 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States found Standard Oil in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so splintered the company into 34 baby standards. Remember, at that time, the Standard Oil Company controlled more than 90% of the oil refineries in the United States. Okay, so that was during the Taft administration that we saw the government go after the Standard Oil Trust. Now, William Howard Taft was a one-term president. Okay, was a one-term president. So there's, of course, not going to be as much for him. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, didn't find, even though there could be arguments that Teddy Roosevelt was Taft was actually more progressive than Roosevelt. Roosevelt was not too impressed, and that's why he ran against Taft on the progressive Republican ticket in the 1912 presidential election. So 1909 to 1913. Okay, so Taft was only president for 4 years. Now, Woodrow Wilson was president for a long time. Okay, I mean 2 terms. I mean, saying about a little bit longer than Teddy Roosevelt, because remember Teddy Roosevelt finished out William McKinley's term, which had just started, but 1913 to 1921. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson, has a 2-term thing going on here. And so as far as that goes, Woodrow Wilson, you had the progressive amendments. Okay, so now first of all, you had the Clayton Antitrust Act. Okay, so the Clayton Antitrust Act. You also had the progressive amendments, which we'll talk about in another lesson. We'll make that our focus area. Okay, so that'll be in an upcoming lesson. We'll make the progressive amendments our focus area. Now, the Clayton Antitrust Act, then also the progressive amendments. Okay, so amendments, and then the Keating-Owen Act. Okay, so the Keating-Owen Act, which went after child labor. Okay, so the Keating-Owen Act, child labor, overturned by SCOTUS. Okay, so overturned by the Supreme Court of the United States. So the progressives, just like FDR and his New Deal, the progressives caught some flack from the Supreme Court. Okay, that the Supreme Court was more conservative than these presidents who were, passing some of this legislation. Okay, so as far as that goes, the Keating-Owen Act is something that eventually, didn't really necessarily take root. Now, the progressive amendments, 16 through 19. Okay, now that is that's the income tax, direct election of senators. Then you've got the Prohibition Amendment, and then finally women's suffrage. Okay, so with the progressive amendments, ladies last. Okay, so those, I would identify those are your progressive presidents, and I would as far as that goes, with emphasis, I think I would choose to emphasize Roosevelt and Wilson, not quite as much individual emphasis on Taft, but knowing that he did, he was responsible for he was president when Standard Oil was broken up. Okay, so as far as that goes, let's see what we've got here. All right, some of this stuff I'm going to be doing later on, okay? Now, Lily, I want to go ahead and talk about muckraking journalist, okay? So muckraking journalist, which as far as that goes, let's go ahead and share again because I've got something ready to go for this. I was working on this before the session. So let's go ahead and take a look. And this is a comparison here of yellow journalism and muckraking. Okay, I think that this comparison is useful here because these are two types of journalism that actually had some things in common. Okay, so first of all, if we're looking for a similarity between yellow journalism and muckraking, sensational headlines and stories, okay, used by newspapers and magazine publishers to increase circulation. Okay, so whether we're talking about yellow journalism or muckraking, we are dealing with these sensational headlines and stories. Now, yellow journalism lacks any other purpose but to sell newspapers and stir up the public. This is kind of a cynical approach that, we want these stories because we want to sell more papers. And if we want to look at not just comparison, but causation, remember that yellow journalism was a causal factor leading to the Spanish-American War, okay, that the USS Maine blew up. And it's like, well, what happened? And enter yellow journalism, and it's like, somebody probably intentionally blew it up. We need to go to war with Spain. And this actually undermined our government's efforts to keep us out of war. A lot of times governments want to go to war when the people don't necessarily want to go to war. But in this case, the government was trying to stay out of war. And because of yellow journalism, there was this popular outcry that we need to go to war with Spain. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Now, muckraking, unlike yellow journalism, is aimed at exposing corruption in government and big business. Okay, so the causation here, when we think about muckraking was responsible for many progressive reforms. Okay, so as far as that goes, when we're thinking about, we're thinking about the muckrakers, okay? So some muckrakers, now you don't need to know all of the muckrakers, okay? But we could look at some, okay? So at some progressive era muckrakers. Okay, so as far as that goes, let's go ahead and take a look here. Now, one, I would say here, Upton Sinclair. Okay, so I would say Upton Sinclair. And Upton Sinclair published The Jungle. Okay, so The Jungle. And let's see what year that came out. Okay, so Upton Sinclair, let's see, and this came out in 1904. Okay, but Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. Okay, so as far as that's concerned, let's see. Okay, that was also 1904. So both of these, Ida Tarbell as well. The Jungle, 1904. So it was published. Now, part of this is unintended consequences. He wanted to show what immigrants lived in, the conditions that immigrants lived in, to show people. Okay, so his purpose. Okay, so he published The Jungle. Okay, so he published The Jungle in order, let's see, oops, okay. So in order to, to show people how, how awful, the awful living conditions that immigrant workers faced in in Chicago. Okay, so in Chicago. So basically in Chicago, now also his point of view, okay, so his point of view was socialist, okay, and hoped, okay, so hoped to advance socialism, by in the U.S. by publishing this. That basically look at how bad these poor people are living. In some ways, you kind of think about Jacob Riis, who wrote How the Other Half Lives, right? But he hoped to advance socialism in the U.S. So as far as that goes, his POV and purpose, okay, if we're thinking about this source, but the effect, okay, the effect was like basically, and this is the thing, you never know what difference your writing's going to make until it gets out there. Is that the purpose was we want to show off, I want to show people how bad the immigrant poverty is, but the effect was a popular outcry against the, for regulation of the meat industry. Okay, so regulation of the meat industry. And then also, so when we think about the Meat Inspection Act, okay, was a result. Okay, so the Meat Inspection Act was a result of this. So looking at that, this is something, and the muckrakers tended to have these kind of sympathies here. Okay, they tended to want maybe more reforms than the general public was necessarily going to be ready for. But that's what he's got there. So a popular outcry is like, hey, I want to show you how bad these immigrants are living, and people are like, oh my goodness, that meat is nasty, and I'm having to eat that. And so it did inspire reform, just not quite the same reform that he had in mind to inspire. So often our purpose doesn't necessarily, it's literature is a form of art. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, that's Upton Sinclair. Okay, so then another one I would look at is Ida Tarbell. So Ida Tarbell, who of course published The History of Standard Oil, published The History of, now the full title. Now, if you wrote The History of Standard Oil on a on a test or on a DBQ, LEQ, SAQ, no problem. Okay, but also published in 1904 The History of the Standard Oil Company. Okay, so in 1904, which basically, was an expose. Remember that muckrakers, they're not on the side of big business. Okay, so so which portrayed, portrayed Rockefeller and his company in a negative and corrupt light. Okay, so basically, to portray Rockefeller as company in negative and corrupt, as I'm going to note here, as corrupt. Okay, corrupt and working against the public interest. Okay, that's the thing, that basically, progressives. Now, depending, it's just, there's a spectrum of conservative to progressive, but somebody who's like hard on the progressive side, they see the interest of business as being at odds with the interest of the average everyday person. If some of y'all, hopefully some of y'all are following things to at least a little bit, Howard Schultz, the former CEO of Starbucks, who recently he's announced that he's considering running as a third-party candidate, that he has, he's been criticized by some people in the Democratic Party for being a billionaire. And Schultz is saying that, like, look, I am a billionaire, but he said I grew up in a housing project in Brooklyn, and I'm self-made, and isn't that the American dream? He asks. So the thing is, just depending on where you are on that spectrum. Now, Howard Schultz, he would be somebody that you would consider like a moderate Democrat. Moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans, they kind of they're kind of drifting in the wind here in the two-party system as it is right now. But as far as that, working against the public interest, now the effect here was, of course, an outcry outcry for let's see, not an outcry for antitrust prosecution, okay, which occurred during the Taft administration. Okay, so the Taft administration and Standard Oil was broken up by court order. Okay, by order of Okay, so basically it went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and it was determined that, Standard Oil was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, was a monopolistic company. Okay, and then of course, I would also mention here. Let me go ahead and just move these folks down because there we go. All right, and Jacob Riis. Okay, so Jacob Riis wrote How the Other Half Lives. Okay, so similar objective as Upton Sinclair. Now, I don't think Jacob Riis was a socialist per se, but Jacob Riis wanted to draw attention to immigrant poverty. So Riis, How the Other Half Lives. All right, so let's take a look there. All right, so How the Other Half Lives. This was a book. Basically, this was an 1890 book. So he's kind of on the this is the basis. He's kind of the godfather of muckraking. Okay, so Jacob Riis was an immigrant photographer who'd made a good living for himself, and it's really one of the first coffee table books if you think about it. It had writing, but it also had illustrations and various pictures. And so, he's showing that, a lot of people in New York City lived in prosperous neighborhoods and they never see stuff like this. A lot of you who live in prosperous neighborhoods, your parents probably won't let you go to places where you would see stuff like this. Okay. And there is an orphanage there, children saying their prayers. And then we see some illustrations of, these are the tenements. Okay. Now, tenements is a word for basically low rent apartment housing. Okay, so as far as that, let me bring these down, and I'm going to bring that up. Actually, you know what? I'm going to bring those down and just copy this other one. Okay, there we go. All right, so Jacob Riis, I would call him kind of like we might call him the godfather of muckraking. Okay, so so basically the progressive era is really just kind of getting started. Okay, so the godfather of muckraking. Okay, so published How the Other Half Lives. Okay, so How the Other Half Lives. And that was in 1890. So before any of this stuff, in order to so that the public could see, okay, so that so that prosperous New Yorkers could see immigrant poverty for themselves. Okay, so because photography, this is really using this new technology. Okay, so this godfather of muckraking, that's kind of my name. I don't know if anybody else ever called him that, but published How the Other Half Lives. Okay, and then of course the effect. Okay, so the effect was prosperous New Yorkers, let's see, immigrant poverty in the tenements. Okay, so in the NYC tenements, that's something in the NYC tenements. Now, these are low rent apartments. Okay, so low, cheap, low rent apartment housing, okay, for themselves. Okay, so the effect was that local that basically there were new regulations. Okay, so new regulations went into effect, to improve some aspects of, so to improve the conditions. Okay, so it did have an effect. Like Teddy Roosevelt actually like took a tour with Jacob Riis, like when he was governor of New York. He took a tour with Jacob Riis, and they went through the tenements together so that he could so that he could see that. And so as far as that goes, all right, now that's going in order. All right, so the progressive era muckrakers, I would say that these are three that I would select. And remember that muckrakers, they're trying to expose corruption in government and also corruption in big business. Okay, so those are some, I think those will be helpful about the muckrakers. All right, so let's go ahead, and we're done answering Lily's question here. Okay, I've got, I need to, John Doe, I need to learn this. I'm actually a little bit embarrassed because I've heard this a few times, but I have not, whatever this meme is or online thing, I'm not familiar with it yet, and I will try to get familiar. Okay, but yes, Jackie, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, hopefully you've gotten a little more context with that. All right. So the the women's Lily, I would say the women's Christian temperance movement, you would see the impact in progressive politics because first of all, you've got the 18th Amendment, which of course brought about prohibition at a national level. Now, the other thing is that this activism that you see on the part of these women for temperance and other causes, this is leading to the passage of the 19th Amendment. So you start to see that in the 1920s, women are finally going to be eligible to vote. Now, in several states, they were eligible to vote already by the progressive era. But of course, you see, because of this political activism from women, you see that the 18th and 19th Amendments, I think those would be the biggest legacies of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. All right. So as far as that, what was the, let's see, so political machines, even though they have their vote, all right. As far as that goes, okay, that one thing you have to realize, Zoe, a lot of immigrants are coming into these cities, and the political machines, they see an opportunity. Now, if they're not helping the immigrants at all, then they're not going to get the vote. So, I mean, it really is kind of a quid pro quo. These immigrants from Poland and Italy and other places, these new immigrants, they are coming in, and they're receiving help. It's like, here's an apartment in a part of town where people speak your language. I would recommend, as long as your parents don't have a problem with it, y'all are in high school, you're under 18 or whatever, but some of y'all are probably 17 older, whatever. The Godfather Part 2 is a great movie, just a great movie, period, but also shows you some of these conditions in the tenements and these immigrant neighborhoods. So as far as that goes, after the political machines were being exposed and shut down, it's a good question, because that's part of what the progressives did as well, that the progressives fought corruption. And so you start to see these things get shut down, but at the same time, you start to see that a decline in immigration as well at the end of the progressive era. So that's a great question, Zoe. I don't see the exam getting that deep. I think as long as you understand what the political machines were, and that you understand that there was an amount of corruption involved in there, but that the immigrants were receiving help, but at the same time, that massive wave of immigration cuts off during and after World War I. And that's, so it just kind of all reaches an equilibrium after that. All right. So as far as that goes there, as far as the New Deal and the turning point between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, okay, that's a lot. Okay, now I would not necessarily identify a single turning point, but I think that the biggest transition, if we had to think about it, and it's really easy actually, because I would say that the ascension of Teddy Roosevelt as president in 1901. So it's like, when you think about late 19th century, the Gilded Age, early 20th century, you're looking at the progressive era. And then you've got to realize, though, at the same time, it's a little bit fluid, okay? Because in 1890, Jacob Riis published How the Other Half Lives. In 1890, you start to see these new immigrants come in. Industrialization's happening throughout the late 19th century and continues to. The Ford Motor Company, is experiencing its growth during the Progressive era. So we still see the growth of business. It's just that government is thinking about how do we manage this growth rather than how do we support this growth. But I would say that definitely just cut it, 1901, when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, I think that that's when you really start to enter the progressive era, because you've got a president that has, at least to some extent, a progressive mindset. Okay, maybe not as far as some people might have liked to go, but Teddy Roosevelt, I think, would be considered our first of the three progressive presidents. Okay, so as far as that goes, there are some of these that I'm going to be doing in in future sessions. Okay, as far as that goes. So let's take a look there. Now, one of the things, CJ, I would say that part of that, if you're looking at the causes of widespread immigrant poverty, is that these people aren't immigrating because they have money. It's like when they got here, they were impoverished. And so at that time, they get off the boat. They only qualify for low skilled jobs. A lot of these people were agricultural workers in Europe. Some of them were radicals who were fleeing their country because they were, either kicked out or going to get arrested. But you don't have a lot of like rich people or skilled people coming in. And also remember that there was no minimum wage. There were no, labor standards or anything like that. So as far as that goes, when they got to the United States, they typically got a job working, working at a low wage. Now, of course, Henry Ford starts to, when you start to see Henry Ford's assembly line, and it gets to where in the 20th century that somebody can make a living in a factory. And that's where you start to see like the improved cloud of labor unions and stuff like that. And they have a better bargaining position because of the progressive era. Okay, so as far as that goes, let me see if I can get just a couple of more here. Okay. And so as far as that goes, the Federal Trade Commission, okay, the Federal Trade Commission, and this is something that's important as well, because you start to see the beginning of consumer protection, okay? Because when it comes down to it, during the Gilded Age, the government was about how can we help business? How can we help business grow? So the Federal Trade Commission is making sure that consumers are protected, and also that we don't have these, coercive monopolies. So the Federal Trade Commission is supposed to look over the marketplace and make sure there's still room for the little guy, and a handful of big guys aren't taking over the whole thing. All right, so that's that. We've talked about several major events of the progressive era, Haley. Now, the United Mine Workers strikes, is that the same thing as the anthracite coal strike? Because if it's the same thing that I'm thinking about, Teddy Roosevelt, let's see, United Mine Workers, 1902. Let's see if that's the same one. Okay, so the coal strike. Yeah, so the coal strike of 1902, that's the same as what you're talking about, the United Mine Workers, okay? So as far as that goes, what did they accomplish? I mean, basically, the big thing here is the showcasing of TR's square deal. Teddy Roosevelt said, I'm going to give America a square deal. That before that, the government had been on the side of business. And Teddy Roosevelt's like, look, the government should mediate between business interest and labor interest. And so you see that with the way that Teddy Roosevelt handled that strike as a mediator, that's what this accomplished. Oh, where would we be, Lily, without Jane Addams and the Hull House? Okay, I tell you what, y'all get ready to get excited. Okay. That's about the only way I can get people excited about Jane Addams. Okay. But Jane Addams was an American sociologist and progressive reformer. People love to put her on test. Okay. Now, personally, I find the whole idea of setting up a house in Chicago, a settlement house, so that immigrants can have, learn to speak English and get childcare and learn some job skills, basically to help them assimilate better into American society, which over the weekend there was a big controversy over Tom Brokaw saying that people who immigrate in this country should try their best to learn English. That was, he apologized for it. He took a lot of criticism for that. But the progressives at the turn of the 20th century, that was basically like what they wanted. That was their objective, was to help these immigrants, assimilate into the melting pot of American society so that they could speak the language, so that they could learn job skills, so that they could become prosperous. Because even today, now, and if somebody wants to disagree with me on that, then that's fine. But if somebody, for example, on your AP test, you have to, I'm not saying somebody should learn English or get out, but when you're thinking about the AP test, you have to complete that exam in English. You cannot earn AP credit if you can't speak English. You can't go to a university in the United States if you can't understand English. So everybody who doesn't understand, it has English as the first language, they have to take the TOEFL, the test of English as a foreign language. And so that's something that Jane Addams, like what Tom Brokaw was saying over the weekend, was very much in line with what Jane Addams was doing then. So Jane Addams, with the whole house, was trying to help immigrants assimilate into American society and become prosperous so that they're not like these people that Upton Sinclair's writing about in the jungle. But make sure that you do know about Jane Addams and the whole house. That's definitely something that is important. Okay. So as far as that goes, I think that we've got pretty much everything. Again, African-American leaders and the Great Depression, all that we are going to do in a future session. Okay. Some of y'all are way ahead there, but we will be getting to that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank y'all very much. And remember that although these weekly sessions are free, go to Fiveable.me, because Fiveable Plus and the membership's really cheap right now. I think it's only like $20, and that's going to get you access to cram sessions closer to the exam. Now, if your teacher got you in here or you're already a member of Fiveable Plus, then you're good. Okay, you're going to get everything that Fiveable offers. But definitely, if you're finding these helpful and you're thinking, hey, I want to get these in late April and May when the exam happens, make sure that you check out Fiveable Plus. But anyway, I'm going to be here through at least mid-April with free sessions every Wednesday at 7 o'clock. So I'm looking forward, 7 o'clock Eastern, of course, and I'm looking forward to seeing y'all next week, where our stated topic, okay, I've got my topics for February. So our stated topic next week is American imperialism. Okay, so I'm looking at American imperialism next time, because I don't think that we've let's see, just to make sure. Okay, so yeah, we haven't done American imperialism. So next time we're going to focus on imperialism and foreign policy. But again, we can take questions about other things as well. So I'll see y'all again next week. And ladies and gentlemen, it is always a pleasure.